One of the most powerful female artists is Artemisia Gentileschi. She was born in Rome. She traveled throughout Italy and even as far as London in England. And she's considered to be a very important follower of Caravaggio. She practices the naturalism and the tenebrism that Caravaggio is famous for. And she spread this Caravaggisti style in Florence, in Genoa, and in Naples. It was not very easy for a woman to become a painter. And almost all, Sofonisba Aguisola is an exception to that, but almost all of the women artists that we know from earlier periods were the daughter or some other relation of a painter. And that's how they were able to get their training. Because a woman couldn't just be apprenticed to any painter. Not only they probably wouldn't take them, but it's not really safe. You can't have an adolescent girl going and living with the adolescent apprentices in a communal situation. And Artemisia's story is going to illustrate that. So she got her earliest training from her father, Arezzo Gentileschi, who's a very famous Baroque artist. And of course, she painted subjects that she was commissioned to paint, but we notice that many of the subjects that she uses are women. Sometimes heroic women, sometimes vulnerable women. And it gives us often a new interpretation of these traditional biblical or classical subjects. I'd like you to look at these two works of art. One is by Arezzo and one is by Artemisia. And let's just ask you one question. Which one of these do you think is the more powerful image? I'm going to guess that you probably picked the image on the right because it shows the figures in a dramatic way, in action, with this dramatic light, the tenebrism. Well, I'm going to tell you a little story about this. In 1968, I took my first graduate courses in art history, and one of them was a Baroque art class. And the professor showed us these two images as slides and said to us that Artemisia Gentileschi was a weaker follower of her father, Arezzo. Well, I'm sitting there in the front row of the class. I'm looking at these images and I'm thinking, it must be the slides. It must be there's something wrong with the quality of the slide, not the painting, because the Artemisia, the image on the right here, is so much more powerful than the painting by Arezzo. Well, 20 years later, I was at a conference, and the speaker was talking about a painting that had been newly acquired by the St. Louis Art Museum. And it was a Gentileschi, and they were trying to decide if it was by Arezzo or by Artemisia. And the speaker said, it has to be Artemisia because it's so much stronger than Arezzo's work. And I was internally cracking up because, as you can see, in that 20 years, the way we look at Artemisia's work and the way we define it had so totally changed. The assumption had been, and this was a problem for the reputations of many women artists, there was an assumption that women couldn't be creative, that women always had to be weak. And even if there was a painting that was thought to be by a man and then they discovered it was actually by a woman, they completely changed what they said about it. They would say, oh, it's a very strong, powerful, wonderful work. Oh, it's by this woman. Oh, it must be weak. We should have realized that. It was like they weren't even looking at the works of art. They were just simply making assumptions about gender. So I think you can see, just by looking at these two works of art, that Artemisia is a very powerful painter. And I think she is one of the artists that we could certainly call one of the great Baroque artists, or one of the great artists really of all time. Now, as we said, she's a pupil of her father, and that's how she got her training. And when she was 15 years old, her father said he could teach her no more. She was already an accomplished painter. So he hired another painter, Agostino Tasi, to teach her perspective, to teach her something more than Arezzo felt he was skilled at. What happened was Tasi raped her. In that day and age, if a woman was raped, she was damaged goods. And the only thing that could restore her reputation was to get married to the rapist. And what he did was, after he raped her, he said, well, I'll marry you. And he kept promising that he was going to marry her. Well, this went on, and she told her father, or found out about it, and he took Tasi to court. Much of the transcripts of the court case exist. They've been translated. You can find them in Mary Gerard's book on Artemisia Gentileschi. And it was a very messy trial. Of course, Tasi tried to damage Artemisia's reputation, but there were people who had said that Tasi was. No, Tasi had done this before. And it's obvious from the testimony that he and another friend had designs on her and had planned to rape her. And it's really pretty horrific. In the process, because they believed that true testimony would be given under torture, she was tortured with something like thumb screws. I think it was actually with a band that was tightened around her fingers. And she, of course, maintained her testimony that she had been raped. And she said something really interesting. She said, and this is the wedding ring you promised me. As she's being tortured. Evidently, Tasi was condemned, but he never served his sentence. He was given a choice of exile for so many months from Rome, or for fewer months of hard labor. He chose the exile, but he never left. And eventually, his patrons got the verdict, or rather the penalty, sort of thrown out. So he served a few months in prison, but never really had any large penalty for this. And what happened to Artemisia was she was, right at the close of the trial, she was married to a minor artist who she probably didn't even know. It was an arranged marriage. And then they moved to Florence. Now, what happened historically was, because rape victims were often, as we said, considered to be damaged goods, their reputations were often ruined. They were considered to be fallen women, even though they were really the victim. And so for some years in history, Artemisia wasn't mentioned, or if she was, the talk was about her sexuality. And it has actually only been in, recent decade or so, where she's been discussed as this powerful artist, which I think when you look at her work, you'll certainly agree about that. She and her husband separated. I think he may have left, run off or something. She actually became a very well-known artist. She worked for major patrons, including the Duke of Florence, the King of Naples, and she had pupils. So she really did have an illustrious career. But as I said, in subsequent centuries, there was even a book written about the Caravaggisti, the Italian followers of Caravaggio. They left out Artemisia, who is now considered by some people to be the chief, the most important of the Italian followers of Caravaggio. Her stylistic characteristics, she is a wonderful example of Baroque naturalism. Many of her female figures particularly show a great deal of strength. And it is believed that she may have used herself as a model for some of them. We've said that in the Baroque period, in the 17th century, you see more robust figures. And frequently she will use either tenebrism or a strong contrast of light and dark. This is one of her paintings of Judith, and it shows the actual beheading of Holofernes, Judith beheading or decapitating the Assyrian general Holofernes. It is a Bible story. It's from the Book of Judith. Now, some of you may not have heard of the Book of Judith. It was eventually removed from many Protestant Bibles, but you'll find it in Catholic Bibles. There's a number of books of the Bible that are in the Catholic Bible that are not in Protestant Bibles. Maccabees, Tobit, some of the wisdom books, Judith, parts of Daniel. And this is a very famous story. You see it in manuscript illumination throughout the Middle Ages. You see it in Renaissance art. You'll see it in Baroque art. And it has, I'll say, a number of meanings for people as well. But let me tell you the story. This is a story of a female hero, Judith, who is a virtuous, beautiful widow, puts her own life and her maidservant's life on the line to save her city from the Assyrians. She lives in the city of Betula, which is a Jewish city, and the city is being besieged by the Assyrians. Now, the Assyrians had a reputation of being very cruel to the people they conquered, and they were great conquerors. They went out from the area that is now Syria. And they go out for their spring campaigns, and when they come to a city, they'd say, "Surrender to us, and if you don't, we'll kill everyone in the city." Well, Betula did not surrender. But they were under siege. They were running out of food. It looked like they eventually were going to have to surrender. And Judith comes up with a plan. She prays, she bathes, she puts on her beautiful clothing that she has not used since her husband died, and she takes with her her maidservant, and they go to the Assyrian camp, where they present themselves as traitors to their own people. They say, "We will show you a secret way into the city if you will spare us and our families." And the Assyrians agree. Now, the Assyrians had this great general named Holofernes. And he's most taken with the beautiful Judith. He invites her to a banquet in his tent. Now, Judith has certain dietary requirements. The Jews are not allowed to eat certain foods. So she's brought her own food with her. And Holofernes proceeds to get drunk and passes out. And Judith takes his sword and cuts off his head. And as you can see, that's what's being shown in this image, this dramatic moment when she's sliced into the throat of Holofernes. And it looks like he's wakened up and is struggling. After they've cut off the head of Holofernes, they put it in the bag. And they've already gotten permission to go out and pray. And so they go out from the camp and return to the city. The next day, the Assyrians think that this will be the last day of the siege. They'll be able to get right into the city. They go to wake their general. And they find the headless body of Holofernes. And then they look up on the battlements of Betula. And they see his head on the and they see his head hung on the battlements. And they're terrified. And the Hebrew army comes out of the city and is able to chase the Assyrians away. And then, of course, there is praise to God. There's a celebration. And it tells us that Judith, the virtuous widow, then never marries. She spends her time in prayer and fasting. But she is the heroine who saved the city from the Assyrians. In other words, it's sort of like David and Goliath. And in fact, that last part of chasing the enemy from the field and praising God and rejoicing is pretty close to what happens after David defeats Goliath, except it's the Philistines, not the Assyrians. There is a difference, however. David goes out on the field of battle. And if he had been killed, it probably would have been a swift sword thrust. He'd have probably been killed instantly. Of course, he wasn't. Goliath doesn't get anywhere close to him. He just throws a rock and kills the giant Goliath. Judith and her servant have to go into the camp of the Assyrians. If they are discovered, they undoubtedly would be tortured to death, possibly raped to death. It's a much more dangerous job than David has, actually, because they could be discovered at any moment. Now, this particular painting of Judith, decapitating Holofernes, was painted for the Grand Duke of Florence, who at that time was Cosimo II de' Medici. And you can see that this is indeed a Baroque drama. It's the moment of the greatest physical action. You have blood spurting out, soaking into the bedclothes. You have these two powerful women with these very strong arms. The maidservant is pressing down on Holofernes and, holding him in place as Judith cuts through his neck and has probably cut through his larynx and his trachea so he can't scream. It's very dramatic and pretty bloodthirsty. You might want to see how Caravaggio showed the same painting. Of course, this was done much earlier than Artemisia's painting. Caravaggio's Judith shows the same moment. They're both dramatic. They both have blood spurting out of the wound in Holofernes' neck. But they're different in the way they show the women. Caravaggio's Judith is almost dainty. I mean, she's got strong arms, but you're not getting this feeling of great force. And the maidservant, which you see sometimes the maidservant is shown as an old lady, sometimes she's shown as a young woman. You can see that in Artemisias, she's a young woman. In Caravaggio, she's an old woman. She's holding the bag, waiting for the head, essentially, but she's not participating. And in fact, if you look at the faces and the facial expressions, Caravaggio's Judith looks a little bit, I'm trying to feel the right word, perturbed. It's almost like she's going, ooh, I don't want to get blood on my dress. Artemisia's Judith is forceful. What we see is determination. She is going to get this head off, and she's really working at it. So you almost have this contrast about, okay, she's this powerful heroine who has to kill a general in order to save her people. And as I said, one of them is, the sort of dainty, perturbed. And Artemisia's Judith is powerful. Both of them show Holofernes as conscience and suffering. Of course, Caravaggio has Holofernes' mouth open as though he's trying to scream, but as we can see, the head is really being severed. We can actually look into the gap of the lower neck. Artemisia wasn't quite so graphic. The beard covers the cut, but Holofernes is conscious and is struggling. Now, this is a subject that Artemisia painted a number of times. We don't know if it's just the ones that survived, and we happen to have more of these that survived, but it certainly shows that she was thinking about this subject and that she could portray it in a number of different ways. Now, the picture that you just saw, the actual moment of decapitation, is in the Uffizi Gallery in Florence. And for years, it was thought that this was the earlier version of the decapitation of Holofernes by Artemisia. But they looked at infrared reflectography. They looked at the underdrawings, and they saw that there were more pentimenti, or changes in the underdrawings in the painting in Naples, which pretty much proves that the painting from Naples came first. And I should say that none of these works have a date on them. So sometimes you'll see different art historical dates. And because they have now decided the Naples picture came first, as you can see, it has a much earlier date. The suggested date is actually when Artemisia is still a teenager, 18 or 19. The painting that was done in Naples was done for the King of Naples. And the one in the Uffizi, as we said, the ruler of Florence, who by this time was a Grand Duke. And as you can see, they're very similar. Some changes in the colors of the clothing of the women. A little bit more of the dark background shape in the Uffizi version. Here are two other paintings by Artemisia of the story of Judith. Now, one of them is in the Pitti Palace, the Palazzo Pitti in Florence, and the other one is in the United States. This is a very large painting. It's in the Detroit Institute of Art, and it is a beautiful, powerful picture. As you can see, in both of these, the women have paused. One is a close-up. You've got the head of Holofernes in the basket, and Judith is holding the sword over her shoulder. And the one in Detroit really defines the moment. They've cut off the head of Holofernes. The maidservant is stuffing his head into a sack, a bag. And you have this dramatic lighting. It's dark except for the light from a candle, the tenebrism here. And Judith raises up her hand. And you really know just what's happening. There seems to be a sound outside the tent. And maybe somebody will come in and discover them. And what will happen? It's a moment of vulnerability, fear perhaps. There's nothing in the Bible that says, they heard a sound outside the tent and they were afraid that they'd be discovered. So Artemisia has thought about what it would be like to be doing this, the secret deed, to be assassinating the general who was going to kill your people, and realized that there was a lot of danger. And she shows that, and she shows the vulnerability of these two powerful women, which is something you don't usually see in pictures of Judith. Now, historically, throughout the Middle Ages, Judith was seen as one of the strong women of the Bible. Allegorically, she was shown as good defeating evil in one aspect or another, virtue defeating vice, or chastity defeating lust. In some books from the later Middle Ages, you have her shown as parallel to the Virgin Mary defeating the devil. So she's shown in a very positive light. Starting in the 16th century and on into the 17th century, you sometimes will see her, though, as a femme fatale, wearing dresses which expose her breasts, or even in the nude, as though she seduced Holofernes. And she's this woman who has used her sexual wiles to kill, to betray this man. Well, of course, the Bible is very specific. It says that she is a virtuous widow, that she remains chaste, and is, quite clear that no sexual activity went on between her and Holofernes. And yet, a woman who kills a man? That became one of the narratives that you sometimes see in paintings of Judith, painted by men. There's some other interpretations, though. During the period of the Reformation and Counter-Reformation, some people think that Judith was shown with, as whichever side you were on. If you were Protestant, she was, the Protestant idea is defeating the Catholics, or if you were Catholic, she is, the truth, or the Catholic side defeating the heresy of the Protestants. I don't know that whether any of those meanings would attach here. There's certainly nothing that tells you that. Now, I said that there were 4 or 5 paintings of Judith by Artemisia which have survived. The other one I don't have a digital image of. I saw it in the Vatican, and except for the colors, it's virtually identical to the painting that her father Arezzo painted, and today is in the museum, the Wadsworth Athenaeum in Hartford, Connecticut. For a while, the painting in the Vatican was also attributed to Arezzo. But Gerard believes that the Vatican painting was actually painted by Artemisia when she was in her father's studio. It was like an exercise to copy his painting, which, of course, pupils were always doing. That was one of the ways they were trained. The apprentices were trained by copying their master's work or copying other works of art. So that painting in the Vatican would be the 5th one that perhaps is also by Artemisia. And it looks a lot like the Arezzo, but I just don't have a picture to show you. This painting, Lawpictura, is considered to be a self-portrait of Artemisia Gentileschi. But it's more than just a self-portrait. It's also an allegory of painting. And the title, Lawpictura, literally means the painting, or just painting. Now, the composition is very interesting. You have this diagonal movement, which we associate with Baroque art. It's very dramatic. And yet, it's a very unusual point of view. We're looking down at her. And this leaves this very interesting negative shape that surrounds her. And of course, we see this canvas that has this brown ground on. You'll remember that Titian used a reddish brown ground to give warmth to his colors. So here Artemisia is doing this as well. She's sketching out her underdrawing or her underpainting. Now, what's so interesting about this is that she essentially embodies the personification of painting. She is the personification of painting. There are many pictures that are allegories of painting. And usually when a male artist paints it, you will see a male artist painting, and sometimes there'll be another figure there, a model, or sometimes a figure of fame, or a figure that is the personification of painting itself. But because Artemisia is a woman, and in Italian and in Romance languages, pictura, painting, is a feminine noun. It's la pictura, not il picturo. The painting, it's a feminine noun. And so a man cannot be the allegory of painting. He can show an allegory of painting, he can paint a personification, but the word is feminine. And so as a woman artist, she can embody the personification of painting as well as be the painter herself. Some of the iconography in this painting is from a very important iconography book. It's Cesare Ripa's Canna Loggia. It was first published in the late 16th century, and then I think it was the 1603 or 4 edition where it came out with pictures, with woodcuts. And basically this book will take different subjects. You know, they could be a virtue, they could be, as you see, painting or architecture, health, medicine, you know, different virtues, and shows a picture and describes the symbolic aspects, the attributes that go with it. And it tells us that pictura, that painting, has unruly locks of hair, because this symbolizes the frenzy of divine inspiration. And you can see that some of her hair is coming down over her face. She's very much involved in creating and doesn't have time to pull her hair back into a perfect, smooth coiffure. The other thing is this mask, this little pendant on the bottom of the chain that she wears around her neck. And as you can see, the pendant is a mask. And Cesare Ripa tells us that the mask is the imitation of nature. And of course, pictura, painting, is believed to be the imitation of nature at this time. Also talks about this idea of the chain, the links in the chain referring to the continuity between the master and the pupil who pass down their knowledge of painting. And so it's been suggested that her use of this could refer to her father, Arezzo, who taught her